Canadian small businesses are facing their worst nightmare, and it started at exactly a.m. Eastern Time on August 29, 2025. After nearly a century of duty-free shipping to the United States, the de minimis exemption is officially dead. And for thousands of Canadian mom-and-pop shops, this isn't just a policy change, it's a potential death sentence. The de minimis exemption allowed goods under $800 US to enter America without extra fees, minimal paperwork, and zero hassle. It was the lifeline that kept small Canadian businesses competitive in the massive US market. But Donald Trump's July executive order just pulled that lifeline permanently. We have cut off all of our shipping to the United States because right now, with the amount of risk and lack of information on shipping to the States, we can't justify it, says Jess Sternberg, owner of Vancouver-based Free Label Clothing. Her words echo across Canada as business owners realize they're staring into an economic abyss. This isn't just about paperwork. We're talking about duties of up to $200 US per shipment, depending on the country of origin. For a small business operating on razor-thin margins, that's not a cost increase. That's a business killer. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business found that nearly 1 in 3 Canadian small businesses relied on this exemption. 1/3 Let that sink in. But here's where the story gets really interesting and really devastating. The United States had been expressing concerns about de minimis shipments for years, claiming they were being used to smuggle deadly opioids into the country because they weren't inspected as closely by U.S. Customs. Trump first suspended the exemption for shipments from China earlier this year, hitting giants like Shein and Temu. But now, everyone gets the axe. Meanwhile, diplomatic solutions are being pursued at the highest levels.
There could be some movement on the Canada-U.S. trade front. The cabinet minister leading those talks, Dominic LeBlanc, is in Washington and met this morning with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. The CBC's Ashley Burke joins us now from the U.S. Capitol. What can you tell us, Ashley?
JP, a Canadian source tells me that there is a sense of urgency right now, that the Canadian side sees a window to try and land a trade deal with the U.S. But the source also says that there are no guarantees that it will happen in the next few weeks. Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc is here right now in Washington. He met with Donald Trump's Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, this morning and posted a photo online calling it a productive meeting. LeBlanc's office says it lasted about 90 minutes, and it's all part of Canada's efforts to try and get the Trump administration to drop or at least lower a series of tariffs hitting Canadian sectors hard. Here's what the Prime Minister said today.
Aluminum, steel, autos, copper. They happen to have a specific on copper, and then, of course, lumber, softwood lumber, which has been an issue. So those are the areas where immediately we are focused on improving the outcomes. In order to do that, we will have to look at other areas where we can have win-win cooperation, other areas.
Today's meeting here in Washington comes after the Prime Minister announced last week that he would drop some retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. because he says he was given assurance by Donald Trump over the phone that it would intensify talks.
And Ashley, you've learned more details about how this meeting came about. What can you tell us?
JP, the Canadian source tells me that after the Prime Minister's announcement that he would drop some of those countermeasures, that Mark Carney and Donald Trump exchanged texts and that they agreed LeBlanc would come here to Washington for these talks. The source also said there was a recognition from the American side that Canada had taken.
Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc has been meeting with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in Washington, following Canada's strategic decision to drop some retaliatory tariffs. This move came after Prime Minister Trudeau received assurances from Donald Trump that it would intensify trade talks. A Canadian source indicates there's urgency to land a trade deal, though no guarantees exist for the coming weeks. The diplomatic chess game reveals the complexity of the situation. Former U.S. Ambassador to Canada Gordon Giffin views Canada's recent moves as smart, tactical steps to restart negotiations that had been paused while the U.S. dealt with other international crises. He emphasizes that Canada hasn't given up much and still has significant equity in the dialogue, particularly given the goods and services the U.S. needs from its northern neighbor. As Giffen notes, maintaining leverage in these critical negotiations is essential for Canada's economic future.
I don't think Canada's given up very much. I think Canada has ground to gain, and I think Canada has the equity and the dialogue to do so, which includes an awful lot of goods and products and services that the United States uses and needs. So I think Canada's in a pretty solid negotiating posture, but a negotiating posture doesn't do any good if you're not negotiating. So I think this effort by the Prime Minister to get back to the discussions is a good step.
And do you think there are other intangibles that might be being discussed in amongst, I mean, we were talking about steel and aluminum as being the big thing, but what about water and the fact that this border between Canada?
Canada still has its own de minimis exemption for goods from the US and Mexico, up to $150 for customs duties, but that's cold comfort when your business model depends on selling to American customers who now face massive additional costs on every purchase. John Buscariol, a trade expert and partner at McCarthy Tétrault in Toronto, puts it bluntly: the end of U.S. de minimis will impact mom-and-pop shops disproportionately. He warns that many of them who have relied on these low-value shipments to the United States as part of their bread and butter for survival are being hit by this and possibly may have to go out of business. Let's talk numbers. U.S. Customs and Border Protection processed more than 1.36 billion de minimis shipments last fiscal year. That's over 4 million packages every single day flowing into America duty-free. Now, every single one of those shipments will face new costs and bureaucratic hurdles. The new cost structure is brutal. According to the executive order, businesses may face an $80 per item charge for countries with tariff rates less than 16%, costs as high as $160 per item for countries with tariff rates between 16% and 25%, and $200 per item for countries with tariff rates above 25%. For small businesses shipping multiple items, these costs compound into business-ending expenses. Canadians can still send letter mail and gifts under $100 US to the US for no extra cost, and companies that meet the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement rules of origin can theoretically still ship duty-free. But even in those cases, small businesses face extra administrative costs for customs clearance, brokerage fees, compliance documentation, and the nightmare of proving their shipments qualify. Jess Sternberg is terrified about those costs. Her business specializes in size-inclusive slow fashion, and the uncertainty around compliance and fees has forced her to completely halt U.S. shipments. She's not alone. Businesses across Canada are making the same impossible choice: absorb crushing costs or abandon the American market entirely. Some companies are trying to weather the storm by absorbing the additional costs themselves. Jen Harper, founder of Cheekbone Beauty, says her company will temporarily absorb the extra costs, a 25 to 30% increase in shipment fees. But she's honest about the long-term reality. We're doing this on a temporary basis to see how much it actually is going to impact our bottom line. But we've made that decision because we don't want to scare any of our U.S. customers away. The ripple effects are already visible. International postal services are taking matters into their own hands. Singapore's Singpost and India's Department of Posts have temporarily suspended some shipments to the United States. DHL said August 25th would be the last day it accepts certain shipments to America. European postal services from Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, and Japan are all suspending parcel shipments to the U.S. Even major e-commerce platforms are feeling the heat. Etsy and eBay announced they won't accept shipping label purchases from Canada Post for packages going to the U.S. The infrastructure that supported cross-border small business is crumbling in real time. FedEx is still accepting U.S.-bound shipments, while Canada Post says it's working with a third party to collect and remit duties to U.S. Customs. But shipping firm Chit Chats will only accept U.S.-bound packages that have duties already paid, shifting the burden and cost entirely onto Canadian businesses. The human cost is staggering. Abbott Atelier Jewelry, a Vancouver-based business, warned customers in an Instagram post that it would pause shopping for a little while as we look for a solution. A UK-based jewelry maker called Shed Made announced its shop would close to US customers, a customer base that accounted for 50% of its orders. It is going to have a huge impact on my business, they said. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. This trade disruption is part of broader author, Atarian tendencies emerging from Washington.
Sorry that you're probably having...
Now, according to U.S. media reports, the Trump administration has been planning for weeks to send the National Guard next to Chicago as early as September, a move Trump previewed on Friday.
We'll go in and we'll straighten out Chicago, just like we did D.C. Chicago is very dangerous.
Thank you. Thank you.
Trump appears to be targeting cities run by Democrats, describing them as crime-infested, unlawless hellscapes to justify his plans. His administration dismissing protests, demanding they stop.
I think you hear these guys outside here screaming at us. Of course, these are a bunch of crazy protesters. We're going to ignore these stupid white hippies that all need to go home and take a nap because they're all over 90 years old.
The Trump administration has announced plans to deploy National Guard troops to Democratic-run cities like Chicago and Baltimore, characterizing them as crime-infested despite local officials' protests and data showing significant crime reductions. These actions reflect a pattern of using federal power to punish perceived political enemies, whether they're Democratic mayors or Canadian businesses. The erosion of institutional norms that once protected American democracy extends beyond domestic politics.
Critics say Cook is just the latest target of Trump's campaign against diversity, equity, and inclusion. But they also say this is about Trump trying to take control of the central bank, which is supposed to be free of political interference. They say that the firing of Lisa Cook, the president directly intervening, will erode the independence of the American central bank and send shivers through global economic markets over the bank's independence or lack thereof. Trump, by the way, says he has the constitutional power to remove a sitting governor for cause, so this is going to end up in the courts, like many other controversial things the president has.
Just as Trump attempts to fire Federal Reserve governors over unsubstantiated allegations, threatening the independence of America's central bank, his trade policies weaponize economic relationships that have existed peacefully for decades. The de minimis exemption wasn't just a trade rule, it was a symbol of trust between neighbors. Tyler Slobogin, senior policy analyst for the Prairies with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, warns that businesses all across Canada will be affected. Manitoba businesses will get hit hard. Many will have to ultimately scale back. The Federation's survey found that nearly a third of Canadian exporters used the de minimis rule to ship their goods. For businesses in British Columbia, the situation is even more dire. A recent survey found that 46% of BC small businesses would be hurt by ending the de minimis exemption. BC is actually one of the most reliant regions on this exemption for imports and exports. Businesses that built their entire model around easy access to American customers are now scrambling to find alternatives. Some are looking at pivoting to other international markets, but that's not a simple switch. Others are exploring the possibility of shipping from within the U.S., but that requires establishing American operations, a massive undertaking for small businesses already struggling with thin margins. The timing couldn't be worse. Canadian small businesses are already dealing with inflation, supply chain disruptions, and economic uncertainty. Now they're facing the loss of what many considered their most important international market. For businesses where U.S. sales represented 30, 40, or even 50% of their revenue, this isn't just a setback, it's an existential crisis. The broader implications extend beyond individual businesses. Canada's small business ecosystem has been built around easy access to the American market. Entrepreneurs who might have started businesses knowing they could easily sell to 330 million Americans now face a much more limited and expensive path to growth. This could fundamentally change how Canadian businesses think about expansion and scaling. There's also the innovation factor. Canadian entrepreneurs won't be able to innovate as much without easy access to the U.S. market. The de minimis exemption wasn't just about shipping costs, it was about opportunity. It allowed small Canadian businesses to test products, build customer bases, and grow in ways that are now much more difficult and expensive. The policy change reveals a fundamental shift in U.S. trade philosophy. The The Trump administration has framed the de minimis exemption as a catastrophic loophole that needed to be closed for national security reasons. But for Canadian small businesses, that loophole was their pathway to prosperity. What makes this particularly painful is the asymmetry. While Canada maintains its own de minimis exemption for U.S. goods up to $150, the loss of the much larger U.S. exemption creates a massive imbalance. American businesses can still ship small packages to Canada duty free, but Canadian businesses face new barriers and costs when shipping south. Some experts hope that de minimis could be addressed in broader trade negotiations between Canada and the United States. If the Canadian government can resolve the larger tariff disputes, there might be room to negotiate a reinstatement of the de minimis exemption for Canada. But that's a big if, and small businesses can't wait indefinitely for diplomatic solutions. The end of de minimis also highlights the vulnerability of small businesses to sudden policy changes. Unlike large corporations that have legal teams and government relations departments, small businesses often learn about major policy changes through news reports or customer complaints. They lack the resources to quickly adapt to new regulatory environments or absorb significant cost increases. For many Canadian small business owners, August 29, 2025 will be remembered as the day their American dream died. Businesses that spent years building customer bases, perfecting products, and establishing supply chains for the U.S. market now face the reality that their business model may no longer be viable. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated either. Many of these business owners took significant personal and financial risks to start their companies. They believed in the promise of free trade and open markets. The sudden elimination of de minimis feels like a betrayal of those principles and a crushing of entrepreneurial dreams. As we watch this crisis unfold, one thing is clear: the end of the de minimis exemption isn't just a trade policy change. It's a fundamental restructuring of North American commerce that will have lasting effects on how small businesses operate, grow, and survive. For thousands of Canadian entrepreneurs, the question isn't whether they can adapt to these changes. It's whether they can survive them at all. The next few months will determine which businesses can weather this storm and which ones will become casualties of Trump's trade war. But one thing is certain: the landscape of Canadian small business will never be the same.